Since Great Lent began back on February 23rd, we've had our eyes fixed on our pilgrimage to Pascha. We had a destination, a plan, a purpose. More recently, we were gathering every day, several times, multiple times a day, caught up, as it were, in the throes of the last days of our Lord, leading up to His crucifixion. We retraced and participated in the entire narrative, from the raising of Lazarus to the triumphal entry, the betrayal, the sham and mock trial, the beatings, the thorns, the cross, all the way through the glorious resurrection. We've wept with the women, succumbed to sleep in our prayers with Peter and James and John, lamented with the Theotokos at the graveside of her Son and our God. And we were glad to hear and join our voices to the song of the whole creation. Christ is risen. The war is over. The enemy is destroyed. Hades is emptied and overthrown for good. And yet, there's still work to be done. Those who've ever lived through war, especially a world war, know this. Even after a war comes to an official end, certain dangers linger and work remains. The work of restoration. All that was ruined begs for repair. And those also who know J.R.R. Tolkien's story, The Lord of the Rings, know this truth as well. After the spectacular destruction of the Ring of Mordor, trouble still lurked in the lands. One of the most significant parts of the story left out of the movie, and I hope I'm not ruining the story for anyone who's reading it to their children right now, is the story of the hobbits' return to the Shire. After arriving back home, they find all that was once pure, good, unspoiled, beautiful, devastated by war, and an enemy, Saruman, still trying to pretend a power that he no longer had, still trying to stir up whatever mischief he could before he had to flee. Think also about the mischief that the devil was trying to cause that first evening of his own overthrow. Think about the last words that we heard here at Agape Vespers of last week. They were Thomas's. I will not believe. Fear and doubt were still widespread, even after the testimony of the angels and the many witnesses. And Thomas wasn't the only one struggling. After all, he joined those who were already there, locking themselves in the upper room. Make no mistake, the enemy was hard at work, trying to convince his would-be captives that he still held some sway of power, some bit of an upper hand. And so now I ask, how was your week? Did you find things this week, bright week of all weeks, things that didn't go the way they should have? Times that it felt like the devil still had plenty of power and influence? Did you have any disappointments, heartaches, even feelings of helplessness this bright week, in spite of the fact that we only just celebrated the glorious Pascha? Then take heart, for that is the story of St. Thomas Sunday. Remember again those last words that we had heard from last Sunday's Gospel. I will not believe. But this Sunday, the Gospel is repeated and picks up and continues to tell the story, and the rest of the story of the resurrected Christ breaking down the gate that barred the way to the disciples' hearts. The light that you received a week ago, the light that is never overtaken by night, radiates farther and farther until it chases away all darkness. Christ, victorious over death and devil, processes himself into every corner of our lives, shooing out the devils that have no business being there. For Thomas and the other disciples, it was very clear. Fear, doubt, and unbelief. For us, it is whatever we struggle against at any given moment. It could be at work, at home, at school. But if we look closely, behind those things that do trouble us, that upset us, we will find the enemy stirring up the same sort of trouble that he stirred up for the apostles that evening and the week after. Doubt, fear, and unbelief. The devils that lurk in these places know that their time is short, beloved, and they will hang around as long as we let them. And like any defeated and embittered foe, they will burn and pillage and do whatever damage they can do while their time remains, while they're being driven back. But beloved of the Lord, Christ is risen.
Truly he is risen.
And nothing, neither locked doors nor heart slow to believe, will keep him from stepping in and speaking his peace. Devils beware and people take comfort. The resurrection has changed everything. Even death is but a sleep, so that there is no longer any such thing as a hopeless loss. Even the driest of bones can be raised to new life. There is and will always be hope. Doubt, fear, and unbelief be gone. But it takes work. And that is one of the reasons Tolkien's chapter, The Scouring of the Shire, was left out of his movies. It was thought too anticlimactic, too mundane. After the intensity of all the battles and the great undoing of the formidable enemy, lesser and more everyday matters seemed unimpressive and unimportant. But these are no less critical to winning. They are no less critical than the labors of restoration that follow any war. For without the repairing of the ruins, victory in any war remains victory in name only. No overthrow is complete if even some part of what was taken by the enemy is not reclaimed. In the last line of The Scouring of the Shire, one of the heroes of the Great War comments on their triumph. I shan't call it the end till we've cleaned up the mess, and that'll take a lot of time and work. And what is true of all wars, those in this world and those in make-believe, is true also of the great war waged by God against death and Hades. It is finished, but it isn't really come to an end until we've covered all the enemy's trappings and devices and driven him back out of every little corner of our life. And clearing up that mess takes time, takes work. So, as God gives us the opportunity, let us do whatever lies within our power to do with the time that is given us, that we might show forth in our lives the truth that we proclaim on our lips. Christ is risen.
Surely he is risen.